And as mentioned, I think this is really, really relevant to a lot of what's been talked about yesterday and today. A couple of key things I hooked into is, right, how can we help your marketing teams reach their OKRs and goals and show incrementality? How can we leverage data and AI to be talking to customers in the right way and being customer-centric? And that's really where I think the heart of personalization sits. If we can speak more relevantly to your customers, if you can do that, right, you can have more powerful, more interesting conversations with those customers, and you can help them, achieve the kinds of goals that they want for themselves. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is how to simplify the path to personalization and a couple key fundamental practices you should be thinking about to either enact or enhance personalization in your institution. So first off, and I think this has come up many times, is consumers expect personalized experiences. They see personalization in every touch point they have with so many different brands. One of the tables I sat at earlier was talking about Netflix, right? And Netflix was one of the very first examples of creating that one-to-one content. When you sign into your account, when I sign into my account, the recommendations look extremely differently based off of the behavior that they have. And so consumers expect these kinds of interactions, especially with financial services, because they're giving over so much data, right? I don't want to only give data and receive nothing in return. I want you to take that data and then be able to use it to say, hey, you know me and you're trying to help me. So those expectations are there. But at the same time, it's often really, really challenging for organizations to deliver that personalization, and I'll tell you a couple reasons why that happens today. So the first is that the sporadic and inconsistent data. So many organizations struggle they have data, but they don't know how to activate it. They spent many years organizing this data, but it's not really usable in any consistent way. Second is lack of resources or lack of technology, right? So to be able to run these kinds of personalized experiences, you need to have the proper teams or the proper technology in place. The third is integration complexity. So 42% state that it's challenging based off of the different resources and trainings that they have available. And then the last one, which is another conversation topic I heard come up many times over the last 2 days, is compliance and legal reasons, right? How do we make sure that we're saying the right kinds of things if we are starting to differentiate those messages? But it is possible to do this, and we work, I should have mentioned, I come from Dynamic Yield, part of Mastercard. We work with many organizations to help create these kinds of personalized experiences. And so whether you just take these tips today or you're interested in trying to get more technology to help you get there, I think what's really important to know that there are your competitors today that are doing these kinds of things. And so it's possible to overcome these challenges with a little help of the right tech and the right technology. And so what this can look like is whether it's increasing click-through rates in your email, increasing transactions if you're an issuer, or increasing growth in credit cards, right? So speaking the right things to the right consumers also results in the right kinds of behaviors that you're typically looking for. So here are my 4 key tips to remember when you start to think about personalization, and I'll go into detail on each one of these. But the first is establishing your goals, right? What is most important to you in your business? Because you need to be making an impact, and you need to be able to tie what your efforts are back to those goals. The second is evaluating your data. So we all have lots of data, but what data do you have? How accessible is it? Is there any other data you're missing? What channels can you play in personalization? So of course, there are a lot of different channels that were talked about. One of the great things about personalization is typically it's in your own owned channels. And so you can fully run and state those messages as opposed to, when you're thinking about paid channels, you have to pay, of course, to be there. And then the fourth is deploying those use cases. So what are the use cases that are aligned to those KPIs? What can we test and what can we learn based off of these ideas? Not every idea is going to be a home run, but there's a lot we can learn by the ideas that either provide lift, that remain flat, or that don't win. What did we just learn about that consumer? Why did we think it didn't work? And then how can we try to personalize better for that consumer the next time? So diving into KPIs, when I talk to different financial institutions, they usually roll up into one of these two core sections of KPIs, but it would definitely be important for you all to think about what are the KPIs that are most important to you. So either the organization I'm working with is focused on an acquisition play. How can we, get more new customers? How can we educate them? How can we engage in discovery? That can also happen for your current customers, of course, if you're trying to engage them in new products or services. Or alternatively, how do we focus on retention and growth, right? So how do we expand? How do we activate? How do we get those key behaviors that we know are super important? How do we get those milestones? And how do we present them to the customer so that we're showing them what they should do, but also why we want them to do that? What's the value for them? Next, you'll want to set those guidelines and, of course, create SMART goals. I'm sure many in the room are familiar, but SMART goals are specific, measurable, achievable, and relevant time-bound goals. Be really, really specific in anything that you do, of course, but especially if you're building up a personalization program. Be really, really specific about the KPI you want to start with. You can always expand, but by being specific, you're able to see, are we actually making movement or are we not, and why do we think that's the case? And then, of course, if you can tie those goals to something being revenue related, that can only help your program more, because then you can go back to other parts of the organization and show, I was able to achieve this goal and it related to this amount of revenue for the organization. That can be a way to help get you more resource or more tech, because you're actually proving, right, that personalization is valuable. Next, you want to start to evaluate your data, and these are the questions I would consider. Where does your data live today, right? What kind of data do you have for known versus unknown users? So oftentimes we think about data, we only think about data for our known users. While that's the case, we definitely tend to have way more data on our known users. You also often have a lot of data on your unknown users, and what I mean by that is those that have not yet logged in to one of your environments. And how do we have lots of data? Because we can see what they're doing on your different owned channels. We can see if they're coming in from a paid media link. We can see if they're clicking on an article or they're viewing a specific product, and all of those data points can help us form an opinion based off of, help us use, right, the AI to say, we think that this person is likely, right? Let's try to confirm yes or no if this is the right path. Also identifying, different attributes, and finally, is there any data that you need that you don't have today? And if there is data that you need, can you actually access that data? Is it possible for you to build in that track? Now, of course, if you have a lot of challenges accessing getting that data, one of the big benefits of dynamic yields past, and for those of you that don't know and are interested in looking it up, we were a tech company that used to be owned by McDonald's and are now part of Mastercard. And Mastercard has a beautiful set of data based off of cardholder spend information. So if you are looking for data because you don't have access to it, or it's very hard to actually leverage, part of what we are able to offer now is understanding data sets based off of cardholder spend. And here's a couple of different examples. So, is someone highly likely to travel? Is someone highly likely to attrish, to leave, right? Is someone highly likely to spend? But these are, of course, just examples, and I imagine you all have tons of data, so look at what your data sets are today, and those data sets are what you can leverage to then apply the personalization for whatever, industry you're in. And then, based off of that data, deliver a one-to-one personalized engagement. And of course, I'll get into a couple of examples of how this can play out, whether that's sending an email to someone who looks like they're likely to travel, or somebody who's missed a payment. Then you'll want to take a crawl, walk, run approach, especially if this is something that's newer to your organization. And so when you take this crawl, walk, run approach, it's really, really important to think about the different channels that you have available to you. Now, typically when we work with different organizations, email tends to be one of the easier channels to start to unlock personalization, but I was having a conversation just earlier today, and I personally think that there's more impact that can happen when you start to focus on the more walk run area. So when you're thinking about mobile app and your web environments, that's really where you can play with more exciting stuff. But if you're just trying to get boots off the ground with personalization, perhaps email or push can be a really great place. Also, those are typically your customers already today, so you do have that more fuller data sets that you can leverage and play with. So let's put this all together, right? Depending on your goals, whether that's focusing on acquisition, depending on the data, depending on the channel, then you can start to think about use cases. I also always recommend use cases to be the last place. We want to start with the goal first, and we can get there based off of all these other factors, which is how do we start to hypothesize, if this is my goal and this is my audience, what do I think is going to work as an intervention or a change, and how can I test it to see if my hypothesis is right? So here's one example of how personalization can play a role, starting with more of a crawl. So email, of course, tends to be an even easier channel because there's typically less integrations required. And so in this particular case, they were interested in targeting high-spending debit card holders. And so by targeting them with a tailored and incentive offer based off of that, in this case it was Uber Eats and cashback offers, they were able to drive up the click engagement as well as able to drive up the actual spend on cards. So this could be just one example. Of course, depending again on your business, you can take that audience that you're interested in and replace whatever content within the email to tailor it to that user or that point of time, or both. So moving into a walk phase, push notifications are also a really, really great way to engage with your user. Obviously, it's a really great way to grab attention. You have to think about how often you want to go ahead and do something like that, because it is, of course, a more disruptive experience. But in this example, AI models were used to identify high propensity to spend on things like grocery, and then again, tailoring that push message with an offer related, to Uber Eats to increase their spend on grocery as well as meals. And then getting into more of the walk phase, including personalized app content. So with apps, of course, we can know more and more about the user. And so taking luxury spend. So you're kind of seeing the same trend here, right? What is the audience and what is the application we want to see? And then my personal favorite is when we start to think about how do we take these in-person human experiences and take them into a digital space. So in this final run example, how do you take somebody who's coming to your site, potentially even for the very first time, so you have really limited data on them, and start to greet them in the same way that you would if they were to walk into a branch, right? Hi, how are you? What are you looking for today? And gathering those data points to then create a fully personalized experience for that user, or guide them down a specific path that you think is most relevant. One of the folks up here right before myself said, it took me 10 clicks to get to the right place. Well, that's the idea with something like this, is that you can guide them gathering information, but also producing value for them based off of the result. So some real life examples from some of the banks that we work with. So in this first case study, we had a bank that was interested in growing their Platinum card portfolio, and so they targeted a luxury spender users to showcase them that premium card. Of course, the hypothesis here being, if you spend more on luxury, you probably have some more income that you're planning on spending for other needs, and therefore a premium card, you're going to get more rewards back based off of that. So using this insight, they sent out a personalized email, and what's really amazing is that they were able to see a 30% increase in growth for that particular card. So the proof is in the pudding. Next, we had another bank that wanted to focus actually on everyday spend. And so using some of our Mastercard models, they were able to target consumers that were low spend with specific incentives based off of their own characteristics. And what's really, really cool about Mastercard specific data is that we can see specific trends to the user, but we can also see broad level trends based off of what's going on in their specific geo or region, what people are spending or predicted likelihood to spend, because Mastercard, of course, has so many transactional data pieces. And so in this example, this campaign drove a 15% increase in everyday transactions and also increased the average spend per cardholder in the category to almost $200, which I think is pretty incredible. And then my last example here is around targeting cardholders who had a propensity for travel. So of course, travel expenses can be extremely high. And so with this model, this bank was able to target those folks who look like they were about to get ready to travel. Now, of course, this is all with like an issuer lens, but I think you can start to think about the other elements you could play into here. Okay, you're getting ready to travel. How can I as a bank help to prepare you for that travel, right? What are the other things you need, whether that's, I know personally for me with Citibank, like I have to tell them that I'm getting ready to travel so my card doesn't get shut off. Like what if you could help to remind them of all those tips and tricks? Yes, maybe that's not as related to like a revenue goal as some of these examples are, but then you're starting to build trust with that consumer and they're starting to think about you more as their primary bank. And we know today most consumers have 4 to 6 banks that they're working with on average. So while you may be stickier than some of the other brands they're working with, you're certainly not the only one in town. And so how do you maintain your position with that consumer? It's by speaking to them like you know them. And so these are just a couple of examples and flavors of what personalization can look like, but I challenge you with your organizations today to think about how can I help that relationship and that conversation be stronger based off of the information I have or the information I want to get for the consumer. So just a couple of key takeaways to remember. First off, personalization is no longer a nice to have. Your competitors, whether that be digital first banks or just the other brands that consumers are working with, are creating these elevated experiences. And so you need to elevate those experiences as well if you want to stay in the game. Second, start by creating clear goals and really hone in on one. I know that all organizations have many goals. For the specific area you sit in marketing, what is the most important goal to you, and start with that one piece of the puzzle. As you grow a program like this, then you can start to tackle more. Assess your readiness of your data and your technology. So what data do you have, and can you really access that data today? Or do you need some more data? Do you need more tech? If you want to change an experience on a site in an email, what does that process look like? How is compliance involved? What do we need to do to create new content so that you can see how ready you are to be agile and to have different messages for different users? And lastly, invest in an AI solution that can help you, create that value. Whether you can do it yourself or you need a little help, like there's a lot of different options for how you can get a personalization program stood up. And the last piece I'll say, that's not here listed on the slide, is also to really, really invest in personalization. The organizations that I work with that are the most successful at it start to develop a team that's centered on personalization in the same way that we now have email and search teams, having one center of excellence around personalization, because personalization happens at every single touch point a consumer has with your brand. And so there are typically so many different silos and organizations that are silos of a business that are working separately, but the consumer sees you all as one bank or one financial institution. So you need a personalization center to help to connect those points, because the consumer sees it as one, even if it's separated internally. And that's everything that I have for you here today. Would also love to open up for any questions if folks want to learn more.
Yeah, thank you. This is great. I'm Alex from T. Rowe Price. lot of great tactics for understanding more about what to communicate with people based off of demographic, spend, geo, segmentation. I'm curious if you have any perspectives on how to activate attitudinal segmentations to know more about how to connect with these people, how to present this information.
Like which channels you want to connect with them?
Channel or tone of voice, and just matching how they think about problems and how you approach them.
So that's really where, and I didn't hit on it as much in this presentation, that's really where the testing component comes in, which is with every personalization, it's recommended to think about, a key audience segment. You want them to be large enough that you're able to create impact and create learnings. And so with that segment, you say, okay, by the audience of like high spenders, right, I'm going to apply a couple different versions of this tone of voice to really test which one of these works best. And that's also where having that primary KPI is super important, because then we can go back to that KPI. We'll of course want to look at other metrics and things like that, but that will be the true heart of our test to say, did this work or not? And so of course I've worked with customers where and from day one, it's amazing, or it's absolutely horrible, or it's flat. That's actually a lot of the middle when we haven't tested something that's big enough. If we haven't made enough of a change to the experience, and that can be some of the challenge, especially in more regulated industries, is of course there's risk and we're afraid to go a little bit bigger, but the bigger you go, the faster you end up learning. So I hope that answers your question, is that you really need to test into these different things to see what works, and that's part of the growth of personalization, is seeing and learning what's going to work for different segments.
Can you kind of help us understand sort of, I guess, the threshold for personalization? So at what point you determine maybe you're over-personalizing to a customer, or even when you're under-personalizing? Like, how do you determine what that threshold is for more or less personalization?
Like getting into the creepy realm if we're...
It's like, when we're on social media, if we were on Google looking for new a new broom or something, and then we get into social media and it's advertising brooms to us. Like at some point, originally at least, that was really creepy. And so like, how do you determine like what that threshold is?
I think it's really similar to what I was saying before, is that you do need to test. And most of the personalization I work with my customers on is their owned environments where it's much more expected. It's like if you're coming back to this bank and you've signed in, I know you know who I am because you have all of my financial information in there. So from that standpoint, I think the expectation is actually much higher, and that most banks are a little more afraid to use that data. Versus kind of some of the experiences you're talking about is like, if I'm following you across the web, I'm in, social media or TikTok or Facebook or these other places, it can get a little too creepy, a little too fast. But I think at the end of the day, we all have different customer bases we're working with, and you need to test in and ask those questions to those consumers. And you can also say, hey, I'm guiding this experience in order to make this better for you. Do you want to opt in or do you want to opt out? We can often leave it up to the customer to tell us if this is too much or if it's not enough.
Are you seeing more locals and regionals versus the neobanks, and traditional banks kind of adapting it faster than another?
I'm actually seeing a lot of the regional banks adapt it faster. I think it's because their organizations are smaller and can be a bit more agile, and so they tend to have a core marketing department that's running like absolutely everything, and therefore they can kind of oversee the entire life cycle of a consumer, whereas much larger organizations have to really start with that crawl, walk, run that I'm talking about, whereas some of the more regional financial institutions we work with can almost immediately from day one jump into like web and app personalization, because to me, it seems like they've got less guardrails that they can play with. And additionally, a little more background around dynamic yield is we also work with other industries like retail and quick serve restaurants, and retail specifically is kind of eons ahead because they had to be, right? They were competing against the Amazons of the world, and they knew they needed to invest, and so they started to build up these teams. So I would also say, of course, we're all talking about financial institutions today, but I would urge you to look at some of those competitors from like a retail and media standpoint, because there's a lot of tips and tricks we can take out of their playbook. At the end of the day, we're all talking about a conversion of some sort of behavior, and the tactics are really similar. The flavor is just a little bit different. Cool. All right, well, if you have any other questions, you can certainly come find me and my team later today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erika.